everybody. I'm Dr. Leslie Carr, and I'm here today with Dr. Craig Malkin. Dr. Craig Malkin is a clinical psychologist, a lecturer for Harvard Medical School, and the author of the internationally acclaimed book, Rethinking Narcissism: The Secret to Recognizing and Coping with Narcissists. A psychotherapist with over 2 decades of experience in clinical practice, his articles and insights have appeared in publications such as Time Magazine, The New York Times, Psychology Today, The Huffington Post, and many others. He's also been featured multiple times on NPR, CBS Radio, and the Oprah Winfrey Network channel, aka OWN. I can go on, but I'm obviously very lucky to have him here with me today. So welcome, Craig. Thank you for sitting with me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's going to be fun.
It is going to be fun. As you know, the reason why we're here is because there's a lot of information floating around in the news these days about the word narcissism and as it might potentially apply to America's new commander-in-chief. And obviously, I think it's really confusing for a lot of people. Plenty of people who are reading the news and hearing these words float around may not necessarily know what they mean. So I thought, who better to talk about it with than an expert on narcissism? So perhaps you could kick us off a little bit by just explaining to people just a little bit about narcissism and how it works. I know you have a great conceptualization in your book of it existing on a continuum where there's healthy narcissism, unhealthy narcissism, psychopathic narcissism. Do you want to kick us off by explaining to people a little bit more about that continuum and how it works?
Absolutely. I think what's really important for people for watching this, for people to understand, is when you hear the word narcissism or narcissist, most people think disorder. Mm-hmm. And neither narcissism nor narcissist have ever been official mental health diagnoses. They're not a diagnosis. Mm. Narcissism is best understood as a trait. I think the easiest way to think about it is as the drive to feel special. Mm-hmm. And maybe we can talk a little bit about why.
Yes.
But just to start out, narcissist means someone higher in traits of narcissism than the average person. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's a definition based on how you group a bunch of people together, and whoever is higher than average, they're a narcissist. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean anything about whether or not they're disordered. That's a separate thing.
Right. I was thinking perhaps we could also think of it as being, if somebody is narcissistic, it's not a diagnostic term, sort of in the way that you're conceptualizing it right now. It's just an adjective that refers to somebody as needing to feel special, perhaps a little bit more than the average person does.
That's right. Mm-hmm. That's right. So if you think about it along a spectrum, we know from over a quarter century of research, the vast majority of people around the world feel a little special, exceptional, or unique, to quote University of Washington researcher Jonathan Brown. In other words, they see themselves through slightly rose-colored glasses.
Right.
There are 4 measures to date that capture this. It's not self-esteem. Mm-hmm. It's an overly positive view of self, just slightly. Mm-hmm. And what we know about people who have this, they're happy and healthy, they feel more resilient, more able to persist in the face of failure. They're more optimistic, and they're, in our measure, which we just called healthy narcissism in ours, they're better able to give and receive in relationships. So that is healthy narcissism. You think of narcissist as someone who is addicted to feeling special. Mm-hmm. That kind of like a drug, mm-hmm. They use the experience of feeling special, in other words, standing out from the other 7 billion people on the planet. They use it to feel good about themselves way too much.
Right.
In fact, turning away from relationships and love and even integrity. Just like anybody who becomes strongly addicted to a drug, they might lie, steal, cheat in order to get their high. Narcissists will do anything in order to feel special. Mm-hmm. What we're going to be talking about today are more outgoing, extroverted narcissists. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And in fact, the other thing people should know is that there's a number of different kinds in the research, and not all narcissists care about looks or fame or money, and some can be extremely quiet. We're going to talk about what we call what I call extroverted narcissists.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That's really helpful because there are a lot of different types of narcissism, and I think that creating that distinction is really important. I mean, one thing that I can't help but want to talk about that you use very effectively in the book is the idea of there being, let's say a scale of 1 to 10, where healthy narcissism would be right around a 5, right? But by the time you're getting to 7, 8, and then 9 and 10, it's those characteristics are becoming so exaggerated that it actually really is either impairing your functioning or at least impairing your ability to relate to other people, right?
Absolutely, right? It starts to interfere in a pervasive way. We're going to talk about narcissistic personality disorder because that's, if you think of looking at my hands over here, we have no narcissism, which can be a problem in and of itself.
Right.
All the way up to extreme narcissism. Let me get in camera. Pathological narcissism.
Yes.
Pathological narcissism is where you see some more dangerous behaviors. Because again, just if you think of it like an addiction, if I'm going to do whatever it takes in order to feel special, whether it's feeling like the smartest person in the room, or the wealthiest person in the room, or the most misunderstood person in the room. There's lots of ways to feel special. If I'm going to do whatever it takes, that means I might even hurt other people.
Right.
And I'm going to rely on that feeling of being special to the exclusion of other ways of feeling calm, not feeling anxious, and feeling good about myself, including feeling close to people, love relationships.
Right.
Extroverted narcissists are notorious in the research for devaluing love and connection.
Right. Yeah. And empathy.
Yes.
Right. So obviously you and I are going to be very careful right now to not speak diagnostically because as licensed mental health professionals, we are not in the business of diagnosing people that we have not treated.
Correct.
But clearly we're here because this is floating around in the news, and you just recently brought up before we started recording, is it John Gartner from Johns Hopkins?
John Gartner from Johns Hopkins University has created a letter where he invited other mental health clinicians to sign the letter stating that Donald Trump has narcissistic personality disorder, that is pathological narcissism, and that he should be removed from office. And this is big. This is not a fringe movement. This is not a small body of clinicians who tip to the left. This is, to date, last I checked, 20,000 signatures and accruing 1,000 signatures a day. So one of the things that you and I need to talk about and help people understand is, what does it mean that these clinicians think this, whether or not we agree with it, and how do you even make sense of that?
Exactly.
And if it's true, what does that mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wonder if maybe we can start to move into this by, do you maybe want to explain for people what, because I know that the term John Gardner used was malignant narcissism. Will you perhaps unpack for people what you think he's seeing that would lead him to believe that something that serious is going on? How would you explain malignant narcissism or pathological narcissism as opposed to the more run-of-the-mill feeling a little bit special, more middle of the continuum kind of thing?
Or a narcissist who isn't disordered, who's just we hear so much about in the research based on measures, somebody who is way too much into selfies and talking about themselves. That's not necessarily disordered narcissism.
Absolutely.
Narcissistic personality disorder is a pervasive disturbance in a person's ability to manage their feelings, function in the workplace or in other professional settings, and maintain connections to others and maintain a stable sense of self. That's any personality disorder. In particular with narcissism, the disturbance is it's a disorder of narcissism, where what disturbs them pervasively in that way where they would lie, steal, cheat, do whatever it takes to feel special, is that intense drive to stand out from the other 7 billion people on the planet. What Gartner means is not just that he thinks that Trump has narcissistic personality disorder. If he's saying it's malignant narcissism, that is a blend of narcissistic personality disorder and psychopathy.
Right.
Psychopathy you can think of as a pattern of remorseless lies and manipulation. Someone who lies to your face blatantly, even if they're caught, they don't flinch. And they don't, people who are highly psychopathic don't experience feelings the same way that we do. You can even look at imaging on this in the brain. They don't experience feelings the same way. So whereas somebody with narcissistic personality disorder, according to research, might have blocks to empathy. They might have the official description is impaired empathy.
Right.
I call it triple E. We can go over that so people can tick off the boxes in their own minds. It's exploitation. Triple E is exploitation. That is doing whatever it takes, manipulating, even if it hurts others in order to feel special. Entitlement, acting as if the world and other people owe them. And empathy impairments, that is becoming so fixated on trying to maintain their special status that even if it hurts other people, they don't care about the lengths they have to go to or the impact it has emotionally on others. Now, the difference is somebody with narcissistic personality disorder might have flashes of empathy. This is what we know from the research. This is what's confusing for people who say are married to somebody with NPD. They see them being wonderful and caring and empathic with kids or with an affair partner, but not with them, the person they're married to. Somebody who has a strong streak of psychopathy, malignant narcissism, in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which outlines all of this, that falls closest to antisocial personality disorder.
Right.
And that disorder is defined by a lack of empathy, not empathy impairment. It means they don't have empathy.
Yeah, wow. Wow. Where to go from here? I mean, I'm kind of wondering if you want to speak to, and again, we're not here to diagnose Donald Trump, but I'm wondering if you want to speak to some of the things that John Gartner is seeing, or that you are seeing, or other mental health professionals are seeing, that is making them think that this applies to him. Enough so that we would be accruing signatures in an attempt to intervene. Do you want to speak to that?
Absolutely. One of the concerns that I think has really brought all these clinicians out, and to the point of risking breaking the ethical code. I mean, it's not risking, it is breaking the ethical code. It's something called the Goldwater rule, informally. That we're not allowed to diagnose public figures in particular when we
named
haven't
after Barry Goldwater. I'll just jump in really quickly because there was a lawsuit after a publication talked about his mental health in 1964, Fact magazine.
And he successfully won that lawsuit because as mental health professionals, we have to actually meet with the person. But what's got people like Gartner, I think, concerned are things that we all see. For example, the press secretary coming out on behalf of the White House, obviously directed by Trump, but by President Trump himself and others, and telling a series of lies that really, one of the standout ones, of course, was the laughably Freudian, mine was bigger than his about the inauguration turnout, over and over again. And the press really pushed Spicer on why come out for the first press briefing with this, and it didn't really give a clear answer to that. The answer is it doesn't make sense. Whether or not that is a sign of severe disorder, again, I leave that to other people to decide, but that's what's concerning.
Well,
why do you go?
One thing I just want to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's fine.
I'm just kind of curious about, because right now we're talking about Sean Spicer and not Donald Trump. And I'm
Right.
wondering how you see that in terms of, are you looking at it through the lens of him just being effectively a tool of Donald Trump's in this way because he is, a part of the administration? Is it the fact that he was commanded by Donald Trump to say those things? Like, how are you looking at that as an extension of Donald Trump's personality?
I think we can be certain that he was commanded to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But even if we want to give the benefit of the doubt and say Spicer was just translating,
Mm-hmm.
Donald Trump himself engaged in tweet storms where he was just over and over again talking about it was the biggest inauguration ever and no one's had an inauguration like this, and just grandiosity, which is typical of people who are highly narcissistic. And I should break in here and just let people know that we know from research that most presidents and politicians score high enough on narcissism measures and traits to be called narcissists. Mm-hmm. Again, we're distinguishing that from disorder. Right. And part of what goes along with that is grandiosity. Mm-hmm. But this is an intense amount of grandiosity. And there's past tweets from President Trump, like, my Twitter has now become so powerful that it can make my enemies tell the truth. That is a concerning tweet.
Was that a statement that he made? Did he tweet that out?
He did tweet that out.
Oh, that's interesting. I missed that one. Okay.
That's from years ago.
Okay.
And this is just in the history of the kinds of things that that Donald Trump has tweeted out. That's just one of them. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. One thing I'm wondering.
And it's just, so I think it's the accumulation of things like that have people like Gartner and these other clinicians concerned enough to sign and say, oh no, we think he has a narcissistic personality disorder and it might even be malignant. Gonna have to double check if he goes as far as to say malignant.
That's what I read. That is the term that he's using. Yeah. Okay. I mean, one thing I'm wondering, there's a sort of bridge that I'd like to create for people, perhaps in helping them to understand this a little bit better, which is perhaps helping people to understand why the lies are so meaningful as they relate to his potential narcissism, right? Which is to say, why do the lies really matter? Like, where does that spark concern, or, on the level of personality, right? Because we can talk about lies mattering, in general and as a matter of policy, but at the level of personality, what do we make of the lying, or why do we care about it?
Yeah, we care about it a lot. Mm-hmm. And Gartner obviously cares about it enough to make a diagnosis, because the problem is, if it's true that President Trump has narcissistic personality disorder, if what Gartner is saying is true, mm-hmm. then there are certain predictable outcomes. There are certain predictable patterns of behavior that result from that. And that is, the more somebody with narcissistic personality disorder, particularly if it's of a malignant type mixed with psychopathy, that's the far extreme, the more they feel their special status is threatened by facts,
right?
By what the world is showing them, the more they will go to great lengths to distort the facts, mm-hmm. to misrepresent, to deny reality.
Right.
And the more they will lose touch with reality. This is the concerning part. Mm-hmm. So you can think of psychosis along a spectrum. So many things in emotional functioning are along a spectrum. And most of us, when we think of psychosis, we think of things like delusions and hallucinations. But that's at the far, far end of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. On the lower end, we have what's called a thought disorder, which is a formal disruption in the quality and content of thinking. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to somebody, if we're just focused on narcissistic personality disorder, this means the more worried they are that they have a threat to how they're special. That is, do they have the biggest turnout? How big are their hands? If they're concerned about things like that, then they will begin to depart from reality. They will begin to distort. They will begin to perpetrate stories that are patently false.
Right.
And they will become paranoid. They will see enemies all around them. Because the more narcissistic someone is, the less willing they are to say, I'm feeling kind of anxious. Instead, they have to look for who's attacking them, making them feel this way.
Create enemies.
So we saw this, we know from research, biographical archival research on President Nixon, that he had that kind of a spiral. He became more and more paranoid. He was taping every meeting. And in fact, just before he was impeached, he resigned before he was impeached. And on the brink of it, he was actually pacing the halls of the White House, holding court with portraits on the walls.
Right.
So really the important point to realize is simply because somebody feels special enough to run for president or become a politician, and that is what it takes. They have to have that dose of narcissism. And they can keep it together enough to become even president. We know from the story of Nixon that doesn't mean that they're not vulnerable to spiraling into something very concerning if they're disordered. It's clear in looking at the retrospective data on what was going on for Nixon that he was suffering from disorder.
I don't know if you feel comfortable speaking to this, but just in terms of what's been in the news lately, do you feel comfortable talking about whether what you're describing right now is just kind of consistent with reports that are coming out of the White House? Just meaning, like, do you feel like we're beginning to see a spiral post-inauguration?
I think, again, all we have, this is the whole problem of making diagnoses, right? The part of, as you and I both know, part of the diagnosis is it has to be a broad, integrated series of conversations and even testing. And a checklist kind of isn't enough.
Right.
It can be a piece of it. So there are pieces that could be concerning, that if you put them together with, say, sitting down in a room with somebody long enough to know what's going on inside of them, that's the piece we're missing.
Totally. Yeah.
Right? That's and without that, you can't make a diagnosis.
Right.
But yes, it's things like getting so fixated on feeling threatened that you go after war heroes.
Right.
And say, oh, I like people who aren't captured. Those are heroes. I can't remember the exact thing. That's throwing somebody under the bus who is clearly a celebrated person in the military. We're talking about McCain right now, or when he went after the family of the son who died. Yes, exactly, because he felt attacked. These pieces are concerning. And if you put them all together enough, and you have information where you know what's going on fully with somebody, and that's the reason that we don't want to diagnose is that it could all be an act, could be for show. But that is the problem. That is the problem, or it could be for an effect. It can be for an effect, and then that's not diagnosis. That's not diagnostic. Because that can actually be adaptive. It can be a means to an end, where it's not the person's character at all. It's something they're doing because they're trying to get somewhere, even if it means playing a kind of role. It's as if it's not really the person. That's the big problem we have in diagnosing somebody remotely from afar.
Yeah, it's a really good point, especially given that he has a long history in entertainment and clearly is pretty skilled at just manipulating the media and putting on a show. He likes the show, so it is.
He is a showman.
It's very hard to tease apart what is, kind of an endogenous, sort of genuine, mental characteristic versus what is performance, or designed to meet an end. I think you're really right about that.
Yeah.
Somebody asked me a question recently, and I'm wondering if you can speak to this, which is, if everything that we're talking about is true, what does it say about the mental health of the country that so many people don't see this, don't understand it, enough so that they either voted for him or continue to support him and that kind of stuff? And I know you were telling me earlier that you've had a lot of conversations with Trump voters and just trying to understand, this kind of schism or split that we're currently seeing in the country. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to why we might be looking at things this way or thinking about things this way or just noticing things in a certain way and putting them together, whereas somebody else might not. They might not be alarmed by the lying, or they might just have a different experience of him.
Absolutely. I think there's some normal processes that go on, that we all experience at times when people are feeling scared or desperate. And there's a wonderful photo essayist, journalist. I think his name is Arnaid. And he traveled the country for years, even before the election, just going from town to town, talking to people about their experience. And he particularly focused on what he called the back row kids. He made a distinction between front row kids, which is, frankly, that's you and me. And I want to have this conversation in a way where we speak to everyone. I can acknowledge that I come from a place of privilege. I can acknowledge that, yes, I'm one of those people who's going to be viewed as the front row kid, and that's the elites who are somewhat untouched by some of the really hollowing out experiences that have happened in this country, that both Democrats and Republicans for decades have been failing to fix. Arnaid went across the country and spoke to people in places like this, and what he found to a person was this anger and this fear that they would never have the life that they wanted again, that they would never have the experience they wanted for their family, they would never have the opportunities, that they would be completely left out in this country, and they continued to feel left out in this country. And for any of us, when we're very, very scared and we are dependent on someone to fix things, we tend to put them on a pedestal. This, by the way, is a part of normal narcissism, seeing somebody as better than they actually are. A great example is, if you're pregnant and you have an OBGYN, most women can identify with this. My OBGYN, she's brilliant, or he's brilliant. You got to go to him. He's the best there. Why? Because your baby's life is at stake.
Yeah.
Right? These are people whose lives are at stake.
Yeah.
And whenever that's the case, this is just one factor. This is a diverse group of people who supported President Trump. But this is just one factor. Whenever that much is at stake, and you have been repeatedly driven down by the people you thought you could count on, the establishment politicians, you need to find a savior. We all do. Whether it's the OBGYN who's going to make sure you have a perfect, healthy baby, and the power of their brilliance will rescue you, or it's people who finally found somebody who speaks unlike any politician that they've ever seen, who seems to be very successful and says, I have all the answers.
Right.
Says, I have all the answers. My gosh, how magical is that? Mm-hmm. So I think when we have those are rose-colored glasses, mm-hmm. right, for the OBGYN, for the person who we feel is going to rescue us, we give a lot of leeway. Mm-hmm. We sort of gloss over disappointments, and it's very easy to start rationalizing, oh, it's not that big a lie, or the media has lied bigger, and anything to kind of maintain, no, this has to be the person. This has to be the person who does it for us. We've all been there. That's what I want to say. This is not just about politics. We've been in love relationships. This man, this woman is the one. No matter how poorly we're treated. And we can't see the lies, and we can't see the distortions, and we can't see how they're treating us in ways that aren't, or others that aren't necessarily, because they have to be the one, because this time I can't be alone again. Right? It happens in love relationships too. So I think that's one piece of it.
Yeah, it's really powerful. I mean, one of the things that it makes me think about is I think about if you look at something like the lying, which is a tricky word, right? Because inherent in the definition of the notion of a lie is intent, right? And we don't know what his intent is, but we know that he has oftentimes said something and then said its opposite, either on the record or in pretty quick succession or whatever. And I wonder if what you're talking about right now in your mind sort of explains why someone who is really exacerbated and exasperated, and somewhat desperate, whether that might explain why the lying didn't seem very important to them.
Absolutely, that would be a piece of it, because in addition to needing this person to be the savior that they might hope that he is, they have this contrast effect, right? Where now there is this backdrop of the whole myth of fake news, where you can't rely on anything as being true anymore. So people can start to contrast and say, well, look at the lies the media have told. Right. And at least, and in their minds, it say at least he's getting it right a lot of the time. But no, we should be concerned when politicians lie. It happens, and we've come to accept it. You can actually go on, I think it's called politatruth.com.
There are a couple different fact-checking sites.
Yeah, I like that one. It actually has the truth-o-meter,
right,
and it measures every single politician on their lies from the mildest all the way to liar, pants on fire. And it turns out that most politicians lie. The question is, how much? So I think there's that. And I think there's this contrast effect where people wind up saying, well, look what the media has done. And they didn't do themselves any favors by not covering the Wikipedia leaks on Hillary Clinton deeply enough.
Or the WikiLeaks, I think you mean to say.
The WikiLeaks,
yeah.
Excuse me. Yes,
the
WikiLeaks, closely enough. The Podesta emails, it was sort of a flash on the screen, and it was really the alternative news sources. Unfortunately, a lot of alt-right news sources, they gained a lot of legitimacy by looking more deeply into it. So I think that's given him a pass too.
When you used a term a moment ago, you said the myth of fake news, and just to clarify, do you think that the sort of the notion of fake news is itself not real? Like, where do you stand on the notion of fake news?
I should maybe even amend what I'm saying, because it's clear at this point that whether it was sources in Russia or other sources, I mean, there were also sources, I think, on the left and on the right that we've already established that just crank out made-up stories,
right,
to be politically damaging. That is fake news.
Absolutely.
I think the part that concerns me, that leaves us without a center or without a compass, is this attack, where, and this is one of those things to be concerned about, where you attack truth.
Yeah.
Where somebody becomes narcissistic enough to attack truth and say the media is the opposition party. That's deeply concerning.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because now we're talking about places like NPR, National Public Radio, who routinely have on, as part of their conversations, people from the right, the far right, people from the left, the far left. They talk to them both. They engage them in deep conversations. You can't get more reliable news sources than this, reporting from all over the world, primary sources, not just people talking about things or editorializing. And that's getting clumped in with fake news. That's deeply troubling. Or
Absolutely.
places like the New York Times that to this day are recognized as really highly esteemed sources of news around the world, regardless of how they've been painted. And some of that painting has had, another example of a tweet that's concerning: all negative polls about me are fake. That is a tweet
That was a
from
powerful one.
our president of the United States. We want to sit up and take notice of a tweet like that because it doesn't take much to realize that there is no logic to a statement like that.
Right.
How can all negative polls be fake?
Right.
And B, why do you have to dismiss all negative views and all criticism in order to feel okay? That's concerning.
Do you look at any of this through the lens of authoritarianism? Where do you kind of come in on that?
Well, so there's another piece to this where, we can think about the range of supporters, and I want to talk about the normal support too. Let's just name, there are going to be people who voted on party lines. There are going to be people who voted smart, conservatives, who voted because they thought this was the best way to go in terms of fiscal conservatism. And then there was going to be people who voted because because Donald Trump has an unabashedly black and white view of the world, which can be very comforting. What we know from the research is that people who have been raised in a household which is more authoritarian, that is, kids should be seen and not heard. It's all about the rule of law. It's all what the parent says, whether it's consistent or not, is all that matters. Punishments can be severe, whether or not they fit the crime. This is an authoritarian parenting style, according to research. And what we know from several studies, according to research, is the more authoritarian somebody's experience has been being raised, the more they're drawn to authoritarian figures.
Right.
Which makes perfect sense because they draw stark lines. This is bad and this is good. And if you're raised that way, and that's how to stay safe in the world, you're going to be drawn to people who talk that way.
That's super helpful. I mean, I'm also thinking about Donald Trump's authoritarian tendencies in terms of his own. I mean, one of the things that I think about when I think about the idea of, something like all negative polls about me are bad, wrong, excuse me, I should say,
Fake.
Are fake. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a way that we can look at that through the lens of his psychology, potentially, a need to distort the truth in order to fit it into a worldview where maybe he needs to feel special. But there is also, by attacking the truth itself, I can't help but think about that as an authoritarian leadership style, right? That it's like he is the arbiter of what the truth is, right? And I guess I just was kind of wondering if you look at it that way, or if you think that that's part of what we're experiencing here.
That's a lens that you can look at it through, and it is definitely it's a cultural lens, and it can be a helpful one. You can even, again, people can tick off the items on the list. Discrediting the first thing authoritarian leaders do is discredit the press,
right?
And they speak directly to the people. That's been shown throughout history. The most authoritarian leaders discredit the press and speak directly to the people. But the other thing that they do is they control truth. Those are related things. I am the arbiter of truth, and that's a way of having control. There is a thin line between being extremely narcissistic, enough to be called a narcissist, whether it's disordered or not, and being authoritarian.
Right.
Because if you are in control, part of what really narcissistic people don't like is to feel vulnerable. The more control I'm in, the less vulnerable I feel. If you're in control of truth and you're in control of reality, then you don't have to worry about feeling shaky or vulnerable or unsure of yourself in that way because you've cornered the market on truth.
Absolutely.
So there's a very thin line between especially pathological narcissism, but even just people who are extremely narcissistic, people who you might call narcissists on the high end. Even before disorder, there's a thin line between that and authoritarianism because of the high need for control.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's also really is echoed in your comment about his black and white worldview, right? Because there's something about that that is very, more controlled and anxiety reducing. The world is very simple when you look at things through that lens. And one of the things that it makes me think of is I'm just so curious about the impact that all of this stuff is having on the country. You use a term in your book that I really liked, which is the notion of a emotional hot potato. It's kind of like, on an individual level, we certainly can see this, that somebody, if they don't feel comfortable holding on to an emotion, they have a funny way of sort of saying, like, I don't want to feel this, you feel it.
Yeah.
And I can't help but feel like I'm seeing that kind of play out on a national level, just sort of in terms of some of the like the kind of the fear and the chaos that people are experiencing. But I wonder if you're seeing that too, or what you think about that.
Absolutely. Two comments I would make. One is that the kind of bleak dystopian view that President Trump has painted of our country frightens people on every level and in every area. Now, again, I think he sort of stumbled into this. I don't think this was strategic or intentional. I think that because he's a good showman, President Trump can play to applause. And he himself has said that he would say things and see what got the most applause.
Right.
So I think he sort of stumbled into that nerve that he hit on of that air of desperation and anger and feeling of being left behind, that he could speak to those people. Now, I've lost. Say your question again. Oh, and I've got it. And so the other piece of this is the more people are stirred up about that, the more afraid they are, the more they are sort of acting in ways that President Trump himself is, he feels threat, we feel threat. I don't want to feel this, here, you take it. Look, there are enemies all around. Let's pass some executive orders, keep everybody out, whether, regardless of statistics on who's dangerous and who isn't. So there's that piece of it. But the playing emotional hot potatoes that you're referring to is, I don't want to feel this scared or insecure, this shaky. Here, you take it. So they act in and say and do things in ways that leave you feeling it, so they don't have to. Well, the whole country is stirred up. So, and they're stirred up on both sides.
Yes,
we've never
absolutely.
seen this in the history of the United States since the Civil War. I don't think we've seen this much rancor and distrust.
I agree with you. And I there's a part of me that kind of wonders, just on sort of a dynamic level, how much that has to do with, when we talk about a black and white worldview, speaking as clinicians, we can kind of think about those as being classically borderline dynamics, which is sometimes just kind of akin to narcissistic dynamics. And I don't want to get, too confusing for anyone who's following this, who's not a clinician, but it's just, a worldview that tends to split things into black and whites and to sort of pit groups of people against one another. And there is a part of me that can't help but wonder if part of what we're experiencing as a country, there's a lot playing into this, right? There's fake news, there's people living in spheres and bubbles of information, but there is also, psychologically speaking and dynamically speaking, a split that is existing that we can kind of think clinically as being kind of pitting two things against one another in a really sharp way.
That's right. Whether it's for show or part of his hard-nosed business style, President Trump, again, thinks in terms of black and white. There's good and bad. There's enemies and friends. And I have mixed feelings. So we have, on one side, we have the snowflakes and all kinds of other horrible names that I'm not going to, there's slurs for people who are liberal. And then there's awful slurs for people who are considered to be too right. And we have, think about this, right, in terms of the split. Who are the bad kids and who are the good kids? Who are the bad people in the country? Who are the good people? Are you
Yes.
with me, or are you with me, or are you against me?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Stephen Colbert made a joke about this years ago, right, where he would bring people on when he was doing his shtick about being the sort of exaggerated right-wing guy with the eagle that comes swooping in. He'd start off with a question like, "Why do you hate America?"
Right. Right.
So, but that's the black and white. It's the assumptions. You're either with me or you're against me, and that
Yeah.
has been passed down too. I get attacked for pointing out in critical ways, and this is all I do on Twitter and social media. I get attacked for pointing out when I'm concerned that I see a lie. And I see a lie coming from the White House, and it's in that very "you're either with us or against us" manner, which I don't subscribe to. So I have
Absolutely.
mixed feelings about the red hats versus the pink hats.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's something about uh, the symbolism that brings people together as groups, but we also know that when those kinds of groups form, all the way back to a study done in the 50s, where researchers, social psychological researchers, split up kids and said, I can't even remember, you give one group one name and one group the other. They were at each other's throats
Mm-hmm.
within days.
Mm-hmm. It's like the Stanford prison experiment, right? Or
Yes,
things like that. Mm-hmm.
become roles.
Mm-hmm.
So I've mixed feelings about the pink hats and the versus the red hats, and how that entrenches this, how it deepens the split that you're talking about. But this is a split that Donald Trump has spoken to,
Mm-hmm.
right? I am not part of the establishment. I'm not one of those bad guys. I'm a good guy. I'm going to drain the swamp, and you all good Americans will follow me. And all those leftists who elitists who don't care about you, they've left you behind, and they're awful. And of course, it's far more nuanced than that.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And we need to bring people together. Like the red hats and the pink hats need to start getting along.
Yes, absolutely. Really well put, by the way. It took me a moment when you first said red hat versus pink hat, but I know what you mean. I could talk to you forever, but I don't want the interview to go on, too long for people to want to watch it. But do you have any kind of last thoughts of what is something that you maybe, if someone could know what you know, or just be paying attention to something that you wish certain people were paying attention to, what are some last thoughts that you would like to leave people with today?
The last thought I want to leave people with is directly related to what we just spoke about. And I sent out a tweet about this. It just sort of went by unnoticed, but I have all kinds of thoughts about this. You need to look beneath the hat,
Mm-hmm.
right? The cure, if you will, in the experiment, I think it was called the robber baron,
Oh, yeah.
the robber's cave
That's what it
study.
is. Yes.
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 The cure, remember, was bringing people together
Mm-hmm.
for a higher goal. They brought the kids together for a higher goal, so they got to know them as people. And there's a slew of studies where you bring together people from diverse races and have them talk as human beings, and suddenly those differences melt away.
Yeah.
And I will give a great example. We went to the March on Washington. We went to inauguration. We went to both. We saw both.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one moment where I wasn't a part of this because it was a girls' night out. So my wife and some of her friends went out after the March on Washington, D.C., and they went to have some drinks at a bar. And on the way in, one of our friends saw a guy in a Trump hat, a red Trump hat. And something about the way he held the door left her feeling like he didn't want her there. So she said, "Let's go. There's too many Trump supporters here. We're not welcome." And my wife said, wait a minute, what about building bridges versus walls? Like, why don't we go in and just see what it's like?
Yeah.
So they went in, they wound up sitting down next to this man wearing a Trump hat, who turned out to be a veteran, and started talking to him. And it turned out at the inauguration, somebody who was an anti-Trump person ran up to him, this war veteran, who was just there because he believed in his candidate, and said, fuck Donald Trump and fuck you.
Wow. And
then ran off. One of my wife's friends looked at him sad and said, I'm so sorry, because he told the story of what he'd been through as a veteran and and what this meant to him. She hugged him. And he gave her a big bear hug back. And the rest of the night, the family with the red Trump hats and the family with the pink pussy hats, my friends and the Trump, they sat together and they had a new toast, not make America great again, make America toast again. So
I like that.
You want to heal the split?
Yeah.
My closing comment is, look at the person beneath the hat.
Absolutely. That is so beautifully put, and what a great place to end. I really like that, and I appreciate where you're coming from. So thank you so much for
It's my
taking the time
pleasure.
to speak with me today. And I know it's drcraigmalkin.com. We'll have it at the end of the screen here, and thanks a lot.
Thank you.